Hello and welcome to Marketing Speak. I'm your host, Stephan Spencer, and today I'm very happy to have Lily Ray with us. Lily is the SEO Director at Path Interactive, where she provides strategic leadership for the agency's SEO client programs. Born into a family of software engineers, web developers, and technical writers, Lily brings a strong technical background, performance-driven habits, and forward-thinking creativity to all the programs she oversees. Lily began her SEO career in 2010 in a fast-paced startup environment and moved quickly into the agency world where she helped grow and establish an award-winning SEO department that delivered high-impact work for a fast-growing list of notable clients, including Fortune 500 companies. Lily, it's so great to have you on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So I would love for us to start talking about how you ended up focusing so much on the technical side of SEO, because there's a lot of, kind of art to SEO, but there's a lot of technical acumen, a lot of science that is where all the details and the things that get missed, all the nuances. And I think that's an area that is is lacking generally in the SEO community. There's not as much technical depth as I'd like to see.
hmm
So I'm curious, where did you get that technical bent, and how do you keep that sharpened?
Yeah, so I started doing SEO when I was pretty young. I was actually just coming out of college, and my brother's a web developer. My father's a software engineer, and so I kind of grew up in an environment where I learned some HTML and CSS and things like that when I was younger. But of course, my between my dad and my brother, they're experts on those things. So right off the bat, when I was working in SEO, I realized there were problems that I needed to solve that were technical problems that were outside of my skill set because I didn't really have a background in those things. But thankfully, my brother was really helpful. A lot of the time, I would just chat him and ask him tough questions, and then it was just kind of trial by fire, like learning how to do things as they came to me with different clients that I worked with. So I think the most important skill in SEO is the ability to figure out problems as they come to you and research the problems and try things and see what works, because it was only through experience and through really working with a lot of like e-commerce clients at my first agency that I was able to put a lot of these technical skills to the test and learn new things.
Yeah. So what sort of tools and resources are you pulling from in order to keep those technical skills sharp and figuring kind of just reverse engineering the Google algorithm?
hmm So, throughout the course of my career, I've been fortunate to, work at a couple different agencies, and the current agency that I'm at, Amsive Digital, is very focused on investing in technology. So we have a partnership with Spotify. We use Sitebulb. I've used Screaming Frog throughout my entire career. A variety of different crawling tools that we were testing out. And then, of course, Google Search Console has just continued to get more and more helpful and innovative over time. So, really, a lot of the technical troubleshooting that you can do can just be in Search Console itself with like things like the crawl stats report. But I think more important than the tool is knowing what to look for and how big of a problem it is, because a lot of these SEO tools just report back basic facts like you have this many 404 errors, but like maybe that doesn't really matter. So just prioritizing what's actually important to fix, I think, is a more important skill.
Yeah. So how do you do that? Like I know when I'm working with a client, I'm making it very clear what the priorities are based on effort involved versus the potential payoff. Right. So there's a
Yeah.
prioritization that takes place, and also in part based on what their skill sets are and what they want to outsource, and so there's lots in play besides just weighing the effort versus the potential outcome. So I'm curious, how do you map all this out?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's always important to keep in the back of your mind when you're giving recommendations to clients or developers, because telling them to overhaul a page template to slightly improve a core web vital metric or something is probably not going to work because as we're all starting to realize that update, the page experience update, wasn't as huge of a ranking factor as many SEOs made us believe that it might be. um, but that being said, I think when it comes to prioritizing technical issues, I like to look more so for things that are relatively easy to fix but have a big impact. So maybe it's something like, the canonical tag is not set up correctly on your category pages or on your product pages, and it's one thing that's broken that's affecting thousands of pages simultaneously. So that one fix is going to have a really big impact. Looking for those systemic issues, I think, is really important. A lot of SEOs get laser focused on small details that might not matter as much, but when you can find those like templated or site-wide issues, that tends to have a bigger impact.
Yep, for sure. What are some of the most egregious errors that you've come across that were kind of system-wide like that?
A lot of it has to do with Google ignoring things like canonical tags, which are suggestions. More recently, sometimes Google ignores title tags. It's not necessarily a technical problem, but like looking at how Google is crawling your website and what they're actually doing as opposed to what we think they're doing when we look at tools like, Screaming Frog and these other tools that illuminate certain issues, you have to cross-reference that with how Google's actually processing the website. So looking at crawl stats, looking at things like the crawled but not indexed report, sometimes you'll notice when that report is working correctly, because I think right now it's not 100% accurate, but when it is 100% accurate, that can illuminate problems like why are so many of our product pages not being indexed? And that report in and of itself is showing sampled data, so like that's only maybe 1,000 URLs potentially that we're looking at. But if you see 50 product pages appearing in there, that's probably indicative of a larger problem. You probably have thin content or low quality content or content that Google doesn't think is worthy of being indexed on its own. And that to me is a very big systemic problem. So it's less about looking at individual URLs and looking more for patterns. I think that's where we like to prioritize our focus, where it's something that can affect, again, the whole site kind of globally at once.
Yeah. You mentioned Screaming Frog earlier on in the conversation. I'm curious, like where does a tool like Botify fit in compared to Screaming Frog, which is quite a lot cheaper? And also,
Mm-hmm.
even Screaming Frog has two different tools: the Spider, the SEO Spider, and then there's a log analyzer. And most people are not using the log analyzer; they're only using the crawler. So, what use cases and examples of key takeaways or findings you were able to glean from using either a log analyzer or a more industrial strength crawler to analyze site
Mm-hmm.
issues?
Yeah, so it depends on, for one, like the budget that you're able to work with. As you mentioned, Screaming Frog is way, way more cost effective for most SEOs and teams than something like Botify. But for certain enterprise clients, you need a tool like Botify because it's cloud-based. Like you can't possibly crawl your clients on your machine without breaking the machine and, or in our case, getting our IT guy getting really mad at us all the time for doing those crawls locally. But yeah, so for our bigger clients that have hundreds of thousands or millions of URLs, we have to use an enterprise crawler like Botify. That's happening on a scheduled basis, kind of in the background on the cloud. So it's not something that's affecting your workflow really. It's just there and all the crawls are stored. So it's really easy to see when something changed from week to week, which is very helpful. Screaming Frog and Sitebulb, I believe, also now have scheduled crawl functionality, which is really great because having the historical crawl data proves to be very helpful in many cases, especially at an agency where we have so many different clients. And it's like, okay, when did this change take place? Oh, somebody added a no index tag 3 weeks ago. We have the crawl that shows that it got added. So that's really important. But yeah, I mean, when it comes to log file analysis, honestly, again, being in an agency, it's generally very hard to get buy-in from clients to be able to grant us access to even view log data. I know that my friends that work in in-house environments have much more access to be able to see that type of data and get information from that type of data. For us, it's more difficult because you really have to get like buy-in and bypass a lot of different security concerns and things like that, which is why Google Search Console's crawl stats report has proven to be so helpful, because even though it's sampled, it's not 100% of all log file data. It's very helpful for getting an understanding of how Google's crawling the site. So thank you, Search Console team, for launching that, because that's been very helpful for us.
Yeah. Yeah. Do you have an example of something that was maybe a big win that you found a technical issue, and perhaps it was a $1 million or multi-million-dollar win to their bottom line?
I would say, well, what's nice is like with crawl stats, you have to set it up on the domain property level. So sometimes, more often than not, it illuminates subdomains that you didn't even know were being crawled. That's happened a lot of the times with our clients where we're like, what's this subdomain? And why is Google spending 20% of its crawl budget across your domain and different subdomains that you have on this subdomain? And the client's like, we haven't touched that in 10 years. We didn't even know that was still in existence. We're like, well, Google's wasting a lot of time on it. So we've cleaned up a lot of that, and just other like, robots.txt modifications that we can make when we see Google's getting trapped in some area of the site that doesn't really matter for business reasons. And just kind of cleaning that up and narrowing that down has been very helpful.
Mm-hmm. How important is crawl budget?
Um, Depends on how big your website is and how much demand there is for your website. I think, for bigger brands that hopefully don't have too many crawling issues or technical issues, I don't know that it's a massive problem or limitation. If you do see a problem again with Google like not like crawling but not indexing a lot of your content, you might want to look into ways to make sure that whatever they are crawling, they are also indexing, as much as possible. Like they're not wasting their crawl budget on resources or pages that don't offer any value or shouldn't be indexed. So I don't know that it's an issue in and of itself, but there's always opportunities to optimize it. And then again, if you see like a systemic pattern where Google seems to be spending a lot more resources crawling something that's not super important for the business. Like a lot of the times with WordPress sites, for example, there's like these slash feed URLs, or with Shopify, it's like .atom, or like these other kind of feeds or types of pages that are just like part of the website, but don't actually offer any value for the searcher. There's ways you can modify the robots file to prevent Google from crawling those things, and that can help them spend their resources on the pages that actually matter.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Gotcha. So would you say a site with million plus pages would be one that would need to spend quite a bit more time optimizing its crawl budget versus a 100-page website?
Most likely, yeah. I think that's probably where you're going to run into larger issues. We have a lot of like publisher clients or big e-commerce clients where they've just been publishing content so much for so many years, and a lot of it doesn't offer any value anymore. So, they might have 500,000 articles that are 10 to 15 years old. And, 10 to 15 years ago, the content strategy is very different than it was now. You could do something like embed a social media post or like a picture with a few words. And then there's just a bunch of ads on the page, and then there's no other real valuable content, but they just let that remain in the index, remain in the sitemaps, and it's not doing anything for the site. So a lot of the work that we do is just making sure that like old content is not bringing down our crawl budget, in the sense that Google's just wasting time seeing if anything changed there when it rarely does.
Right. And it's not just about preserving crawl budget. It's about making the site look more valuable to Google because there's more rich
Yeah,
content and few, if any, thin content pages, right?
exactly. Yeah, I mean, that's the end goal. I'm always saying like put your best foot forward with all the pages that you do want indexed, and anything that you're allowing Google to index is being really counted against the overall evaluation of quality on your site. So, people always ask, like, should I have tag pages indexed? Should I have author pages indexed? All these things. Have them indexed if they offer value and they're a page that you think somebody would benefit from if they landed on it from Google. Author pages, yes, I think you should. Tag pages is a tricky subject because a lot of WordPress sites just allow anything to be indexed and anything to be tagged. So I wouldn't do it willy-nilly, but I would look for opportunities to like take those tag pages and make them something valuable if they are going to be
Yeah.
indexed.
My opinion on tag pages is they shouldn't be in the index. In most cases, they're not valuable entry points into a site, and they're duplicate content.
Hmm.
in many cases. So,
Yeah.
and then there are people who just don't put any uh, consistency to their approach to tagging, and then they end up with tag
Yeah.
pages that have very similar sounding tags, maybe a verb and a couple of verb tenses, and maybe uh, synonyms and so forth. That can be a real mess, and all that ends up in the index.
Yeah. Yeah. That's a common problem, especially with sites like WordPress sites where maybe out of the box they allow tag pages to be indexed or different types of archive pages to be indexed. And then maybe the editorial teams don't have a solid process around what's a category and what's a tag. And people think tag means hashtag. So they go and they write all these different things, and then the other author's writing all these different similar things. And suddenly, like you said, there's a million overlapping or duplicate tag pages. So if you are going to allow them to be indexed for the sake of the quality of your overall site, you really have to be careful about avoiding duplicate content and making sure the pages actually add value.
Yeah, yeah. So this whole concept of content pruning is important for a large website. Is it something that a company should do on a ongoing, like every month reevaluate sort of basis, or is it more of just a one-off and maintain certain standards and then you don't have to content prune ever again?
It depends how much content you create. It's kind of funny because the last couple of years, a lot of the work that I've been doing with my team has been around like pruning or eliminating or consolidating, merging pages together. So really just kind of like reducing the overall number of URLs in the index. Whereas, maybe 5 or 7 years ago, the focus was pretty different in SEO. It was get as many pages out there as you possibly can, write as much content as you possibly can, try to rank for all the things, regardless of your authority on those topics. And it worked. And so, launch an affiliate website, write about all these things, put affiliate links on it, and make a bunch of money really quickly. That worked. And it's Google's cracking down on these types of tactics. So, like a lot of the work that we do in terms of helping sites recover from algorithm updates, in terms of getting in line with what Google's looking for with the product review update, it's like maybe we don't have the authority to write on all these different topics. Maybe we wrote the same thing 10 times on 10 different URLs over the course of the years, and that should be really just one article. So it's kind of funny that it's reversed in that way. I think a lot of these Google updates and Google announcements all boil down to them like just not wanting spam and low quality content. So we have a lot of work to do to clean things up.
Yeah. So what would be some of the ways that Google is cracking down? Like you mentioned the product review update. What are some of the ways that Google algorithmically and through manual means is cracking down?
So the core updates are probably the biggest example. Almost every site that we deal with that has been affected by core updates, which is a lot of our clients at this point, they have a problem where they were doing something that was a gray area as far as Google's quality guidelines are concerned. And maybe they didn't even know that. But like, let's take, for example, a very common problem that people have, which is having a page for every city in the country, even though you offer the exact same thing in every place. Or maybe you don't have a business address in every place, but you want to rank for that city plus the, service. And you use the same template on all those pages. Google can identify patterns like that. It's very clear because I've worked on so many of these different types of sites that have been impacted that the last few years of algorithm updates, they've been cracking down on those types of techniques because I think they see it as not helpful for users. So, I think through the broad core updates, the product review update, the small tweaks that happen between the big updates, they're constantly refining what it means to have high quality content. And I think for the most part, they're very interested in uh, not necessarily longer pages, but just more helpful pages that, things like jump links, for example, where you can come to a page and you can navigate to the section that's most important to you. And then we have passage-based indexing or ranking rather, and all these things where it's basically like Google doesn't need an individual URL for every single keyword that you're targeting. It might be better off that you take a group of related keywords and have just one page.
Can you give us an example of taking that approach?
Yeah, so let's try to think about how to describe this without giving away my clients. We've had clients, so like, let's take eHow, for example. It's not a client of mine, but like these types of sites where it's like how to do XYZ thing. And then, in the past, they were ranking really well for a ton of different topics because they have these how-to articles for everything you can imagine under the sun. And I think that included a lot of your money, your life content. So like how to treat acne naturally, or how to treat a cough, using like natural products or whatever. That's something that Google's really been cracking down on. It's like publishers who don't have, for example, like medical authority or, scientific authority, or, aren't like renowned journalists or news journalists or anything like that, talking about these very consequential topics that have a great impact on people's safety and their security and their well-being and their health. Um, that might not be a technique that can bring you traffic anymore, depending on who you are as a brand and as a publisher. So you can potentially, first of all, see if you have the authority to publish on those topics, but then also, like, to the point of consolidation, maybe you wrote about, have 10 different pages about 10 different types of tea and the benefits of those different types of tea. Maybe you should have one page about here's the top 10 types of tea and all the different benefits, and then you can just kind of navigate within that page to the individual types. So we do a lot of work like that with our clients, where we notice, like, you guys have so many different URLs that would actually just benefit from being on one page.
Right. That happens a lot on e-commerce sites where you have different colors of the same product, each with their own unique URL, instead of
Oh yeah.
having all of it consolidated to one product URL, even though you might have separate SKUs for each color, but it's really the same product with one or two or three different color choices.
Yes, that's a very great example, and something that I definitely uncover in many cases when I work with e-commerce clients. I think some Shopify sites have that set up as the default. So it's problematic because, and that's a good example of, like, when you go into your crawled but not indexed report in Search Console, you might see those different color variants not being indexed. Or you can just kind of like go into Search Console and look in your performance report and then take the name of the product, filter by just that name, and see all the different variants and how much traffic they're getting. In many cases, you're going to see, like, Google kind of chose one as the canonical and then the other ones are not really ranking. That's a good indication that you should probably have those pages consolidated. It's a lot of work, but again, it goes into this larger trend of Google wanting sites to have less duplicate and thin pages and more consolidated
Right.
pages.
And the traditional fix for this issue is to use a canonical tag, and yet it's only a hint as far as Google sees it, so it may not obey those canonical tags, and thus you end up still with all those different color variants in Google's index, even though you've applied best practice SEO and applied all these canonicals.
Yeah. Yep. Canonicals being a suggestion, that was so my last agency that I worked at, I was primarily focused on e-commerce. And I would say it was like maybe 6 or 7 years ago, it was like, wow, I didn't know canonical was just a suggestion. I thought it was a directive. And now I know because Google's ignoring a lot of them. But I think when they ignore them, it's a good indication that there's something that maybe you should reconfigure as far as your canonical strategy goes, because maybe you are a company. Like, I used to work with a lipstick brand that had, they were known for the different colors of their lipstick. So in that case, you wouldn't want them to all be on one page. Like, you might actually want the individual colors to have their own because people are searching by those color variants. So if you're seeing patterns like that where Google's ignoring it because they think that users want an actual page that just shows that one color or that one variant, then maybe that strategy doesn't apply to
Yeah.
you.
Something you just mentioned a few minutes ago was your money or your life. And that is a Google term, actually. It's in the quality rater guidelines from Google, YMYL, your money or your life. Those types of sites get a lot more scrutiny than just regular sites about basket weaving or whatever, right? So if you were to kind of break down what are the key um, things to know from the Google quality rater guidelines, besides the fact that you're going to be much more of a target if you're in the YMYL set of categories? What would those be? And I know I'm pitching you a softball here so that you can talk about EAT, but there's more to the quality rater guidelines than just that. But yeah, let's talk about it.
Oh yeah. I mean, there's like 165 pages or something, and they just updated it last week for the first time in a year. So I just wrote about that on a search engine journal. But it's interesting because one of the updates that they made this year was the definition of your money, your life. And they also did that last year. So it's like almost every time they update the guidelines, they seem to be expanding this notion of your money, your life. And at this point, it's pretty comprehensive. Like, basket weaving is a good example of something that's probably not your money, your life, but you can almost make the argument that all content is, especially if it's e-commerce, it's accepting people's credit card payments. So in that sense, it's your money, your life. Um, but of course, the further along the spectrum you get towards talking about things like health conditions and politics and news, that's going to be the most your money, your life content. But to your point, there's so many other things in the guidelines. I strongly encourage anybody working in SEO to look through this whole thing because there's so many nuggets of information about what Google perceives to be high and low quality content. They have links to examples throughout the guidelines that show you actual pages that they rate high or low quality. And you can extrapolate from those examples and say, like, that looks a lot like the client that I'm working on, so I know I need to change these things. But so they talk a lot about EAT, which is expertise, authoritativeness, and trustworthiness. EAT is more important the more your money, your life, the site is, or the page is, or the topic is. But it really seems to be the case that they're using EAT as this blanket, um, you know, assessment of how valuable, how high quality something is throughout the guidelines. They mention it over 100 times. So I think just familiarizing yourself with these notions of high and low quality content, and then there's a whole other section of the rater guidelines, which is like, does this page meet my needs? So that talks more about intent. And then there's also like, the raters are tasked with flagging things as like offensive content or adult content. So just knowing all these different inputs and signals that Google's looking at when it does these quality evaluations, I think is really important to understand what's happening with your pages.
Mm-hmm. So what would be an example of something that would be maybe even counterintuitive that you found through analysis of the quality rater guidelines that perhaps our listener or viewer is not implementing, likely not implementing?
So honestly, most of it to me is pretty intuitive. I don't know that anything's necessarily counterintuitive, but the first time I read it, I was pretty struck by like how specific Google is about like EAT and researching reputation of brands. Like they say, for example, take a brand name, put the brand into the search results, look for things like Better Business Bureau ratings, look for Yelp ratings, Amazon ratings, any other third-party site that you can look at, how many awards the individual authors have won, like very specific and nuanced evaluations about how to determine how much EAT a person or a brand has. And honestly, before I read the guidelines, because I think they were only made public in like 2015 or 2016, or maybe a little bit earlier than that for the first time. And again, like the guidelines are not an active uh, like demonstration of what Google's currently doing with the algorithms. It's just showing how they evaluate quality and what will happen potentially in future algorithm updates. But that actually, reading the guidelines really changed my perspective of SEO because it used to be, again, just like make sure you have your technical SEO in order and publish kind of like on whatever topic you want, just make sure it's optimized. But the guidelines really confirm you have to really think long and hard about your brand and people's experience with your brand and your authors and everything. And that's fundamentally changed my approach to SEO and our teams. And the results have been pretty clear. Like it's pretty effective that focusing on these types of strategies is very effective for SEO
Yeah.
nowadays.
So let's say that a client of yours, a new client, comes in and they don't have the awards, they don't have the certifications, they don't have the author pages that have these contributors listing certifications and awards and so forth. What would be uh, this first port of call, the first opportunity that you would have them work on or work on with them?
Yeah, it's a good question. I always say like everybody has to start somewhere. I wouldn't use those hurdles as like, well, this isn't going to work for us because you have to start building a foundation if you want to succeed on Google. It's probably going to take a very long time. And if you're publishing on your money, your life topics, like health topics, it's going to take even longer. And it's very hard to compete with the big players in certain categories. But what I always tell clients, even if you're a small business or like, let's say you're like a college professor who has a blog or something, I work with a client like that. Um, you have an area of expertise, hopefully, because that's why you started a business in the first place. So an example that I used in some recent presentations was a tattoo artist that I worked with here in New York. And, I built the website with him and he was tattooing and I was asking him questions and I was writing blog articles literally only using the information that he gave me. I didn't do keyword research. I didn't look at what everybody else had written and just write the same thing. I just wrote what he told me. And that was, 4 or 5 years ago that we published these blog articles. To this day, they're ranking in featured snippets for like very, very high volume tattoo keywords. So the only thing we did was just leverage his actual expertise. So I'm always telling people like, don't start necessarily from doing keyword research to pick the highest volume keyword. Start with the areas of expertise that you as a professional and you as an expert actually know. And what do you want to share? Like, what do you want to tell the world? And start your content strategy from there because that like genuine expertise, I think, is going to translate into better performance over
Mm-hmm.
time.
Right. And when addressing the trustworthiness side of it, so that's the T in EAT, is that about getting more high trust links? Is that about something other than that? Like where do you see the trust side of this, and how
Mhm.
to boost that?
Yeah, so again, it depends what type of category your site is in. So it's pretty clear for e-commerce, there's all kinds of signals that you can demonstrate throughout the site, like, Trustpilot integrations or just star ratings or a clear return policy and, a good Better Business Bureau rating, like all these things that consumers would actually look at when they're looking to make a purchase, I think are important for EAT and for trust. If you're a news publisher, Google's made it very clear throughout the news ecosystem that they're looking for these transparency signals. So who are your authors? Authors should have bylines, biographies. Where else have they written online? What are their credentials? Having an overarching like editorial policy page or how do you source information? How do you check your facts? All these signals that you can add throughout the content. Think about it from a user perspective. I think if you look at the biggest players in the health space nowadays, or science, or anything like that, when you load the page, all the above the fold content has like who wrote this, who reviewed it, who are the experts behind it, learn about our policies, learn about our our leadership team, everything, how long we've been in business. Like all these things are signals that help users, and I think also indirectly help Google as
Mm-hmm.
well.
Right. Well, you brought up Google News. Let's actually talk more about that. There's a set of uh, rules and requirements for publishers in order to be in Google News, in order to rank well in Google News as well. What would some of those be?
Yeah, so Google News it's actually an area where Google's a little bit more forthcoming when it relates to EAT. So they say, for example, like you need to have author bylines. You need to be transparent about your editorial policies and guidelines. Um, you should be publishing at a certain cadence. You should be using news XML sitemaps. There's a Google Publisher Center, which is kind of like a separate Google product that can help manage, your logo and some information about your brand. I've had some success with actually just editing the information that's available in Publisher Center for our clients. And they recently rolled out a handful of new manual actions specifically for Google News and Discover that are pretty strict. So you can't have any content that could be flagged as like hateful, violent, adult content, swearing and profanity, like a lot of very strict content requirements because they're really kind of protecting the trustworthiness and accuracy and almost like family friendliness of a lot of the news content that gets put out there. So, and then clickbait is another big thing as well. They seem to be cracking down on clickbait for both Google News and Google Discover. And we've actually had a client receive a manual action for that, despite, from our perspective, the content wasn't really clickbait, but it seems like they're getting more aggressive with sending out those notifications because they're really just trying to create like a good, trustworthy ecosystem for the consumers of that content.
How would you define clickbait from a perspective of not being spammy or uh, over over promising and under delivering?
Yeah, so clickbait is when you, again, overpromise in your headline something that's not that either. First of all, it's not even revealed in the content. That's a big problem. Second of all is when you make the title more extreme or more shocking or just emotionally provoking than the content actually is. Ironically, I've done some research lately about Google Discover, which is an area where Google says don't use clickbait. The content that performs best does a lot of the things I just described. So especially with the headlines, like it seems that in Google Discover, Google's looking for these very emotional headlines, but you have to deliver on the content and you can't bury the lead as well. So like, you won't believe this one thing that this company did. Don't spend 300 words leading up to it before you get to the point of the article. Help the user get that information above the fold as much as possible, even though that's kind of contrary to a lot of business goals that publisher websites have. I think the risk of being eliminated from products like Google Discover is too big of a risk these days. So I think abiding by their guidelines as it relates to clickbait is very important.
Yeah. And for our listener who's not familiar with Google Discover, could you describe it briefly?
Yeah, I've been talking a lot about it recently because so many publisher sites are starting to see more traffic from Google Discover than from organic search. So Google Discover is a product that is somewhat like a social media feed that's customized based on your Google history. So your personal account on Google. So it takes a lot of different data points, potentially even what you're doing with Gmail, what you're doing with YouTube, maybe even like where you're standing, like all these different data points that Google has. And it creates a curated list of content that you can see through the Google Chrome app or through just going to google.com if you're logged in on your mobile device. And it refreshes, I want to say multiple times every day. And you can see a curated list of content that's almost scary in terms of how accurate it is to your interests. And then you can kind of tell Google, I want to see more of this content, less of this content. But if your site ends up ranking there, which a lot of publisher sites nowadays get just so much traffic from Discover, it can bring more traffic to your site than SEO. So for a lot of publisher sites, or even not even publisher sites, like different clients that we work with, they're not even paying attention to this, but the blog article that you wrote for SEO might even be doing better in Google Discover than organic search. So we're really taking this approach because they're both organic channels. It's both essentially free traffic. Um, what's working in Discover, what's working in SEO, and there might be kind of like two concurrent strategies that you can use.
Great. And let's move on to another area of Google where there's a lot of maybe misinformation or misunderstanding. And you spoke briefly about it already, but let's dive deeper into it. It's the page experience algorithm update and the core web vitals component of that. And there's a lot of work involved in passing all three core web vitals if you're not currently doing so with your site, and getting your page speed scores to be in the green. Like, how important is this? What do you need to work on, and what are some of the nuances of this page experience algorithm?
Yeah, so it's the three new Core Web Vital metrics are just a few of several other metrics that Google looks at as far as page experience. So that's one thing that's important to keep in mind. Um, but And it's also important to keep in mind that I keep talking about recently, and I have been talking about, is that this is a lightweight signal. My friend Glenn Gabe talks about this a lot as well. We were recently on an interview together where we talked about this page experience update. There was so much buildup and so much anticipation, but it didn't end up being as big of a change as people anticipated. It also took 2 months to roll out, so it's very hard to isolate whether the work that people have done to improve Core Web Vitals actually translated into better performance. But that being said, it's part of a larger strategy of page speed optimization that sites should be focused on regardless of their SEO rankings. I think it's very important to think about performance and page speed. um, I was excited about CLS, cumulative layout shift, because that's, when you load a page and then the page continues to move under your cursor or under your finger on your phone. And that's very frustrating for users. So when Google, announced that metric, I was like, that's great. That being said, a lot of the best performers still have horrible CLS. So, I think it's important. I think it'll increase your conversions if you focus on Core Web Vitals. I just don't know that it's the biggest SEO signal that sites necessarily need to be focused on first and foremost above things like improving your website architecture or your content quality.
Yep. And how about the links? Where does link quality fit in your opinion?
Yes. I tend to not list links as like one of my main areas of focus with SEO, but that's not because they aren't important. Of course, they're very important. The reason that I frame it that way is because it's so hard to build links in a way that's in line with Google's guidelines that more often than not, people that are building links are violating Google's guidelines and potentially getting websites in trouble. And then a lot of those sites come to us and say, we got in trouble, can you help? Um, so I think it's better in most cases to focus on content quality and then, of course, some version of digital PR, social media to get links in an organic way where people are truly finding your content valuable and linking to it organically. Because so much of the in between is another example of what Google's been innovating and trying to crack down on with its algorithm updates, whether they're broad core updates or the updates that happen in between. It's pretty clear that most forms of link spam and black hat SEO are becoming outdated, sorry to say. So if you're focusing your efforts on paying for links, it might work now, maybe, but the risk of getting penalized or the risk of Google identifying those tactics and then making them obsolete, I think is pretty high. So you should focus on links, you should get links, but do it in a way that's 100% in line with their
Yeah.
guidelines.
Yes, and the guidelines have had not paying for links be part of it for, I don't know, forever, for a very, very long time.
Yeah.
So this isn't new news for a skilled SEO. They just
Oh,
may
yeah.
be, yeah, skirting the guidelines because of convenience or because they're after a short-term hit and not
Exactly.
sustainable rankings and benefits for the client. So, what would be an example of a link campaign that you've seen that was totally above board and really innovative, and maybe even yeah, like something that you'd want to show a Google
Hmm.
engineer?
Yeah, there's a lot of them. I used to attend MozCon in person before the pandemic, and hopefully again in the future soon. And Lisa Myers, she might have changed her name. I don't know what her new name is, but Lisa Myers shared a lot of really interesting and exciting examples. I think the one that stuck out most, and this is a good example of how link building should be done if it's being done by, SEO and digital PR teams, was like how dirty or what's the dirtiest part of an airplane interior? And it ended up being the tray table. But it was like this whole thing where they went into the airplane, they tested all these different parts of the plane, and they discovered it was the tray table. And then they published this big study with all this data behind it. And I think there was a video and there was all this like, the different formats of displaying the same information. So like an infographic and just like really interesting and exciting visuals to represent the research that they did. And as a result, it not only got links, it got like TV press coverage, and just became this huge campaign where it got a lot of eyeballs and it was on the front page of Reddit and all these things. So that obviously takes a ton of work to do that type of research and to create nice accompanying visuals and videos and everything, but that's going to get you probably enough links, like more links than most sites are able to get. So again, it's a different side of SEO. I think at this point, it's not even SEO. It's really a different animal in and of itself, like digital PR. There's other companies that are specializing entirely in that, and we partner with some of them because the reality is, like, my SEO team doesn't pick up the phone and call journalists all day to pitch our ideas. That's PR. Focusing on like what is a cool piece of content that we can create as a brand that's going to be very helpful and something different that hasn't been done before, research that hasn't been done before, is going to be the best approach, because that will authentically get a lot of eyeballs and a lot of
Yep.
links.
Yep. For sure. Now, out of the different updates that you've come across and studied and so forth, what have we not discussed in this episode that we really should be?
Well, we've talked about Broadcore updates. We've talked about Google News and Discover, which continue to innovate with new updates. Google, I mean, a lot of what Google has been announcing this year throughout its different documentation and things like the Search On conference and all these different Google communications, they almost always talk about EAT at this point. Um, they always talk about like the work that we're doing to make sure people can tell that brands are trustworthy and legitimate. So there's this new feature on Google called About This Result, where you can click 3 little dots next to the result and see information about the brand. So that ties back to EAT. I guess one thing we didn't talk about is what Google's doing with like images and Google Lens and AR, and being able to like look at a product in your living room on your phone, things like that. I don't know how much of that directly plays into what we do day to day on the SEO side, but it's clearly a big area of focus for Google, and also Google Shopping as well. So I think that ties into what they're doing with, displaying a lot more data from Google Merchant Center, knowledge panels becoming more robust with product content, and the ability to use Google Lens to look at a product and shop for something directly on Google. I think that one of their many initiatives this year is to kind of become a bigger competitor to Amazon. So we'll see how that
Yeah.
goes.
Yeah. So speaking of images, is there anything particular that you figured out or just want to share with our listener or viewer about Google image search? And let's say that the listener wants to rank higher in Google Images. Is that something that you would first of all recommend? And if so, what would be some strategies and tactics to achieve that?
Yeah, there's a lot to say about that. I think number one, we talked about Google Discover. High quality images of a certain size, 1200 pixels or bigger, are crucial or required for Google Discovers. That's one consideration. There's all types of recommendations about performance and loading of images, making sure that they load quickly. My colleague Ramon Damery, he published a really great article for Search Engine Land about image optimization that goes into great detail about those best practices. I think that for e-commerce websites, you can see a big impact in terms of image traffic and conversion rate optimization as well, if you use actual photos that you've taken of the products, professional photos, as opposed to some image that maybe came from the manufacturer or like a stock photo. So the more unique, if you can provide images of your products or your services or your storefront or whatever, taking your own photos is going to be more effective than just using what's already out there.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And what about optimizing these photos to improve page load time, to improve the quality of the images? Like, what are some of the techniques that you recommend for an existing catalog of images on a website?
Yeah, I mean, you can use a CDN, you can, implement lazy loading, making sure your image file isn't massive. It's something that we find for a lot of
Yeah,
sites.
yeah. You could just go right
Honestly, when
into
it comes to the
Screaming
best
Frog,
practices.
and when you run your
Yeah.
crawl, you can go just to the images report or tab and then sort
Yeah.
by the file size of those images.
Exactly. And there's a lot of best practices around what type of file format to use for different images as well. I don't have those all memorized, but again, the article that I mentioned before, like my coworker Roman, he went into great detail about all these best practices. So I would encourage listeners to check that out.
Yeah, we'll include links in the show notes to these different articles that we've discussed in this episode. So yeah. Awesome. And what would be something that we would want our listener or viewer to take action on as kind of a next thing? You know, a lot of people are just passively consuming podcast episodes and then moving on to the next one. That doesn't actually move the needle if you don't implement anything of what you've learned. So what would you recommend as a next step?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's just a lot of SEO misinformation out there, and that it makes a lot of sense. First of all, Google's not always 100% clear about um, everything that factors into SEO evaluation. So that's one aspect, is like a lot of the articles that come out from the SEO industry are people speculating and reverse engineering things and trying to figure things out, but like we don't have all the information. So I think it's really important to not take SEO information at face value, which can be challenging, but a lot of people, and also like understand that SEO from 2 or 3 or 5 years ago might be completely different now. A lot of the rules have changed. So it's really important to not make decisions without a true understanding of the facts. So cross-reference the facts as much as possible from Google's own documentation. They have a Google, SEO center essentially in their developer side of the Google site that provides all of the answers. A lot of the SEOs are speculating about, or as much as they can. So I would encourage people to really look at those guidelines and make sure that you're making decisions off of that data and not just what you read on some random SEO blog.
Right. And I think one really easy next action for our listener to take is to go through the quality rater guidelines, even if it's just a quick scan through it, which again, I'll include a link in the show notes on that on a 160 some page document. So where would our listener or viewer go if they wanted to work with you and your agency, or at least learn from you?
Yeah, so I share my thoughts kind of stream of consciousness style all the time on Twitter. It's Lily Ray NYC. You can find me personally at lilyray.nyc. And then I work at Amsive Digital. So if you wanted to work with our agency, you can reach out to Amsive Digital.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much, Lily. And thank you, listener. I hope you apply what you've learned here and not just move on to the next episode. At least pick 3 things here from this episode and get them done. And we'll catch you in the next episode. I'm your host, Stephan Spencer, signing off.